So today's webinar is about Before Bourbon and America's First Spirit. And
yes, we see it.
Perfect. If I walk too fast, please interrupt me. I have a lot of pages I like to actually go through, but these pages will be shared with the audience. So you can actually get these. There's a lot of more information very likely on it. But I really try to give a good overview about the historical narrative that is often overlooked in today's spirits marketing. And this is a webinar of the first part of two. That means I will this time just focus on the historical part, and on the American Distilling Institute conference back in August, we will actually dive into a second part. So keep that in mind. This is just the historical part that lays the foundation for what's to come. A little bit about me. So my name is Caroline. I'm a distiller and a liqueurist here in beautiful East Ellijay, Georgia. And my company is House of Applejay. So we're producing here local liqueurs. And I'm also a founding member of AMBRu campaign. AMBRu stands for American Brandy Rum campaign. So very early on, I have, with a friend of mine, Christopher Brooks from East Stroudsburg University, found the love for the 16th and 17th century and the distilling there. And so it's actually a primary focus of mine to take a look at primary sources about early American distillation in this time period, and to see what kind of effects and implications that actually has for our today modern spirits categories. Now, the purpose of this webinar section, so as I said, this is the first of two, is actually to take a look at the American distilling chronology. It's a favorite word of mine. And the key here is I will take a look at the documents and the evidence we actually have for brandy and rum production. Now, historical narratives have interestingly shifted a little bit over time. And the question is, why does our today perception differ from historical records? And today, my goal is actually to reconstruct and to put into the correct timeline the primary source-based facts that I found about American distilling. And I hope, and this is also what we are taking a look in part two in Miami, that this is actually something we can discuss in person, how to use and utilize this actively as distillers and change certain perspectives and position our products and brand our products historically correct. And what I mean with that, so in the first part, as I said, we go through the documented evidence, so early distillation records. We go through the brandy and rum production in colonial America, and we correct the timeline. Now, in the second part, I will talk about trade policies that we have today, about geographic indications, and also about the branding and the perception and how we can change that. So I know a lot of people will say, hey, put the second part into the first part, but it is actually a lot of information. So I was very happy that Eric actually said, hey, let's do a webinar first about the historic part so that we are all on one page here. So what is actually the modern perception problem? And that's very interesting. So if you ask someone in the streets, what is brandy and where does brandy come from? Everyone will say, oh, brandy is European, that's cognac, that's Calvados. With rum, everyone will tend to say, hey, that's Caribbean, that's Barbados, that's somewhere Jamaican rum. And with whiskey, we have a little bit of a split. Many say, hey, bourbon is American. And then we have, of course, the Irish whiskies and the Scottish whiskies. And this feels really natural. We know this narrative. And but the question is this actually correct, that we classify these categories as they are? And I will show you that a significant input was done by the 20th century marketing to cement that we believe brandy must be European, rum is Caribbean, and whiskey is American, Irish, or Scottish. And also in the following, there have been designed trade protections. So we all know cognac is protected as a trade to be just through the cognac region, so is Calvados. And we also have very often simplified narratives. Now, one good example that I always go through is chronology versus marketing. So there is this flag that you see on the right hand about Mount Gay rum and Barbados. Someone snapped that on a vacation, which is a beautiful slogan. I love it. The rum that invented rum. It's a perfect slogan. It's awesome marketing. On the right hand side, I actually show you one early map of the colony of Pernambuco. I will actually get to that a little bit later, which might have actually a better claim for being the place to have invented rum, or one of the places. But the key is, this flag is what we have today in our minds. This is what we see. And it creates for us as young American distillers that are going into the brandy and into the rum field, a very interesting topic or problem, because the commercial narratives and the marketing misplaces a history. So is this Barbados really the place that invented rum? And if so, it overshadows the actual chronology of facts. But the consumers believe that we as North American distillers are actually secondary. They believe that something that is old and has an old heritage, it must be better in quality. And this transfer of emotions and of heritage actually shows a little gap that we have to bridge. Either we invent something completely new, or we actually take a look, is this narrative correct? Because regardless of quality, there is, if you have an historic marketing storytelling for your product, there will always be let's call it a spillover effect. Even if your distiller is 21 years old, if you're working in the oldest distillery in the world, you actually have already more credibility. And this is why I say history matters. A lot of us know from today's marketing and storytelling, this is the oldest distillery in the world. This is the oldest distillery in this county. This is the first distillery after Prohibition. So we always try to tie into historic facts to actually give our products a meaning, where they come from and what they are. So the interesting thing is that chronology matters historically because it is a form of legitimacy, a wonderful word again. And it's also a beautiful way of storytelling. And as producers and young distillers, we are actually competing within these historical frameworks. So these frameworks also influence a lot how categories today are protected. And as I said, I will touch that topic next time in Miami. And just to give you one idea, cognac was the first time protected in 1909. It wasn't even enforced. It was enforced in 1936 to 1938. And Calvados, for instance, we see in 1942, and rum agricole from Martinique in 1996, which is actually the oldest full rum protection. And all these have historical storytelling in the background. And that is, I think, something that just emphasizes how much we have to look at our history. Now let's jump into American brandy. So I start with the earliest distillation activity. And I know a lot of people will say, Caroline, there is a guy that was called George Thorpe. He came over with the Berkeley 100 in 1620. And he, yes, did have a still pot on site. Now, his still pot was small, and the Berkeley 100 disappeared. And they found later on a second journey to search for them, they found the still. But the still was basically for very likely personal use. And at the time, 1620, it was also for medicinal use. It was not yet a commercial entity. And in the following, I will really focus on commercial distilling, because if we're trying to focus on what people did at home, it will be very, very difficult to verify. But if we find documents, person A sold something to person B, and my definition of commercial is really simple. I just need one person to sell a bottle and to be allowed to sell it to a second person. Then we actually get suddenly a clearer picture of where commercial distilling started. Now, in North America, we start in New Netherlands with commercial distilling as early as 1630s. I repeat this, it is 1630. This is almost in the very, very earliest beginning. And there was Kilian van Rensselaer. He was a patron of the West India Company from the Netherlands. And he formed and opened a village called Rensselaerwijk. So Wijk means in Dutch city or little village. He basically named this village after himself. And from the beginning, he included distillation as part of colonial development. And this is really fascinating. Now, let me get to this. So if you take a look at this map on the left-hand side, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor.
Yep. I have a couple questions. When you say that it was a personal use, was it like a 1 liter pot still that he probably brought over versus, like, how do you define personal versus commercial? And where was that colony at?
So those were Berkeley 100. That was one of the earliest settlements they had. Personal, I actually have not found any documents. It would be interesting to look into this, how large the still really was. So we do know from medieval that there have been very small still pots to make medicines. So like a household chore. We do know that there were transportable. They were among the belongings. It was not in the way that you could have distilled 500 liters or 50 liters. So I assume they were more like 5 liter size, but this is now an assumption. And for every historian, hey, if you know it, let me know. I'm really eager to answer this myself. So yeah, I think this is something that needs to be digged in. But the key here is, for me, I do not define commercial distilling by the size of the still. I define it by the fact one person sold one bottle to another. Because, as I said, otherwise you go crazy. We cannot assume that, we can assume maybe a lot of people did private distilling, but we will not ever get a clear picture of what are the facts. Great. And that's kind of the problem. Now, if you take a, I'm jumping. If you take a look, can you see my cursor? So here we have an older map. This is today the Manhattans, the Hudson River up. You see in the middle, there is Rensselaerwijk. So it's quite upriver, and you see a little tiny black dot. This is actually the only map I have found where you see Fort Orange or Fort Orange. Now, this is fascinating because Fort Orange was built in 1624 and it lasted until 1664. And on March 4th, Kilian van Rensselaer hired Jacob Albert Planck of Edam in the Netherlands, and he shipped a large brandy still. And again, I do not know how large this still was. It was supposedly, though, for commercial trade, so very likely a little bit larger. And he shipped it to the colony. Now, as I just showed, Rensselaerwijk is up the Hudson River in Albany, New York. But what's fascinating is this is, as a matter of fact, the earliest documented example of commercial scale distillation in North America that I have found. And I can show that on the next page. To make clear, so on the right-hand side, you see a deed. This is not the deed for the distilling contract. I did not find that, but I thought the writing and the handwriting of Kilian van Rensselaer is fascinating. So this is a property deed. But I have found in the translated Van Rensselaer Bauer manuscripts, I have that put on the left-hand side. And you see here this little arrow that I put up. The proof of commercial distilling. And it states there, Planck, at his own expense and risk and full charge, may distill brandy, anisette, or other spirits, or brew beer to be sold to the men of the company, or to the savages, or do otherwise therewith as he shall think fit. Well, sorry for that. And now, this is a clear, oh, sorry. Sorry, my voice just got blank. So this is a clear contract to distill, and it is in writing. And we do know that Jacob Albert Planck of Edam, he was not only a distiller, he was also a steward, church precentor, bailiff, but he has a clear authorization to distill brandy, anisette, and other spirits. In case someone doesn't know, anisette is a liqueur. It's a little bit of a licorice tasting liqueur. Now, and the primary source here are the Van Rensselaer Bauer manuscripts from 1634. This is as early as distilling goes back in North America. And as I said, this is really fascinating. Now, it even gets a little bit more fun. Now, we also know of early distilling, a little bit indirect. So sometimes a dispute is a good thing, I suppose. There is a member of the New Netherland community that is called Cornelis Melen. And he actually had a distillery on the Manhattan Island. Now, for everyone, Manhattan was spelled with one T, and then it was spelled with two T's. So it is, if I quoted with the one T where it was spelled with one T. So in this case here, we see that there was a notarial disposition in Amsterdam, now in the Netherlands in Europe, in 1649. And in this disposition, they basically stated that there was, at the house of Cornelis Melen, a distiller that distilled brandy at the requirem's house, and that he actually worked together with William Kieft. And William Kieft was at the time, governor of this little island. Now, the interesting thing, if you take a look on the right-hand side map that I found in an old book, this is a map of 1652. Now, if you take a look at the house M, this is Cornelis Melen's house. And this is supposedly where all the distilling happened. This might be, I'm not sure. Again, we need to ask historians if they have some more access to pictures, but this might be the oldest house of a distiller in North America. We do know also that they actually intended to make the distillery outside. Go back. Sorry for that. We do know that they had the plans to make the distillery outside on an outer property, but then they had some troubles with Native Americans, and also Melen disagreed with Kieft, which actually in the end led to this deposition here. Now, in this deposition, there is a clear quote of the word brandy. Now, I like to make one point, and this is the biggest problem we will run into constantly. So the word brandy goes back to the Dutch word brandewijn, which means burnt or distilled wine. So the original brandies were all distilled wines, as very clearly the word states. Now, historically, this word was not necessarily always used correctly. And it is questionable, and there are hints that maybe also grains have been distilled. And some people say maybe it was the oldest whiskey distillery in North America. The problem is just with the categorizing and terminology of the word brandy. We can never be sure if brandy really means in the ending brandy. But we have some arguments, and especially in the time of 1640 to 1649, 1652, that actually underline that maybe it was not the grain distillate they were focusing, maybe it was something else, because I call the argument grain is food. And this is one of the strongest and most interesting arguments if you're taking a look at early distilling. Because if you think about it, you're going to establish a new colony, and in the following, you have to build up farms and crops and everything. And in every time in history, it happened that certain years had lesser yields, and especially with grains, grain meant food, grain meant bread. And in Germany, since 1545, there might be an earlier source somewhere, but this is the oldest decree of the Ratsdekret that I could find. I find a constant prohibition of corn, so grain distilling, for making distillates, Kornbrand, which is basically grain wine. And these lasted on off up until the 17th century because there were times of scarcity of food. And to be sure, grain has quite a long storage life in comparison to fruits. So they tried to actually store and storage the grains to be sure they really had a surplus. Now, interestingly, back jumping to Manhattan, New Netherlands, on November 8, 1649, we actually see a first ordinance that prohibits the exports of grain and also limits the using of grains for brewing. And similar in 1652, we actually see a complete ban of using grains in the Manhattans, New Amsterdam, and also colony-wide. So apparently, this tells us that grain was not necessarily a complete surplus. So it was there were restrictions on grains, and also on, of course, products that were related like beer and grain-based distillates. So this is something that I just want to keep in mind when we're saying, yeah, the definitions were not clear. If brandy was really 100% just from fruit juices, but it is always a possibility that it was. So, of course. Now, let's take a look at orchards and how much the early colonists actually had access to fruits. And we see from April 1625 to 1647 that we have several large orchards being built. So we know from the animal fleet, the very early 1625, they're brought over as cuttings from apple and pears. And then it basically goes over the years, apples, cherries, pears, peaches. And in 1647, Director General Peter Stuyvesant built one of the largest early orchards on his bowery. So what we can assume at this point, and there are many household scripts that actually refer to that cider and perry is basically a cider on pear base, were produced in small amounts. Maybe, and let's get back to that, little private still pot for medicinal uses. And maybe there was also the availability and the idea to distill some of that. In these early days, we also know of jacking, basically freeze distilling, if no still was available. So the concentration of alcohol was basically achieved by just lifting, if it was a cold night, the frost and the water from the top of the ciders that they left outside. Now, the big question that everyone at some point is asking, well, why was our society actually focusing on brandy, whereas why did this emerge early, and didn't we really make whiskeys from the beginning? And my argument that I am saying is I believe it was not a cultural preference. I believe it was a reality of the agricultural surpluses that were available. I believe that it was much easier to have fruits and wines that were not lasting long without preservation. And of course, people and settlers wanted to preserve the energies therein. And the big advantage of distilling is you actually have a very long shelf life, and you can actually store that for quite a long time. And colonial grain supply was unstable. We have seen that. It was bread. It was survival. We need grain to survive, especially in these early days. So my summary is that the distilling of grain too early actually threatened the food supply. So I suppose that the importance of fruit-based distilling was much higher than we originally anticipated. So, and taking a look at this fruit economy, I have a drawing, an old drawing here on the right-hand corner of a mill, an apple cider mill, which is pretty interesting. It's actually automated. I suppose the little guy down here, he's probably collecting some of the juices, or I'm not sure where the juice falls in this drawing, but it shows that they already had larger scale cider making. It was not something small. And we know apples were available. They were actually also kind of difficult to store. We know in certain amounts, a certain amount of time, month, you might be able to store an apple, but over time they will actually fade away. And the key is here, it was a practical survival technology. Keep the energy, distill, and you have a longer shelf life. And it also enabled portability, because to ship a lot of wines is much more difficult than to ship a few barrels of distillates. So brandy is actually seen in a lot of documents all over the colonies. So if you're searching from the 1630s onward in the Hudson River Valley or in the New England coast, you find them in inventories, tavern accounts, trade records. So it's constantly there. It has a steady presence, but it was never a really a big cider making singularity or a big cider making boom. It was like every farm and every tavern and every city had ciders and brandies. And I think this is as a summary very important to see. In American early distillation, the available agricultural surplus, that is what actually was distilled. And in my belief, it was not a lot of grain in the beginning. I believe they actually used a lot of the fruits and the juices and the wines that they had available. And that grain followed significantly later. Now, the interesting thing is, though, that if you take a look at modern spirits categories, there is nothing that really shows American brandy as a historic product. I'm not saying there are some companies that have historical ties, but it's not something that is over several states. So what's also here, this is a little excursus. Let me just check on the time that I have still time. A little bit fast forward, and this kind of underlines my argument. We have Johnny Appleseed, John Chapman, 1776 to 1845. Why I put him in here is because I believe that he used the same blueprint that the early settlers did for a successful settlement. And he started planting apple seeds immediately, and the colonial requirement, 50 apple trees within 3 years, and you actually can claim the land. And he started planting in 1797 in Pennsylvania. Now, his apples, everyone knows, were the so-called bitter spitters. They were not really edible at the time, but of course they were really great for cider making and for distilling. And my argument here is this orchard-based alcohol production actually was a key to a very practical strategy to expand the frontier into the new territories. So it was a successful plan to say, first you plant the trees, you have an orchard, and from there you can actually develop. So the alcohol was part, very likely, in the cider making, the perry making, and small scale distilling of these early settlement strategies. Now, to finalize and summarize what brandy means, I nicknamed it the quiet spirit. And I say that because you see, we see a lot of French cognac and Calvados, but as I said, I don't see a lot of American brandy. And why is that? It's very simple, because we are lacking a centralized trade identity, and we're lacking a strong branding. And I'm not talking about Applejack. I'm really talking about a product that can compete with cognac and Calvados, something that is on the same level. And it's not that we're not producing it or that we don't have the know-how to do it. We just don't have told the story yet. And this is why I believe that we need to change this perspective today. And I also believe that brandy was from the beginning very much and quietly in the background, and just was always there. It just never made a big bang to show, hey, here's American brandy. And so let's hope to change that. Now I'm coming to the next chapter, which I call the rise of rum. And I know everyone who followed me so far, thank you very much. I know it's a lot to intake, but I will actually hope to make this journey very interesting. So let me start with sugarcane. So sugarcane is around since 6000 BCE. It spread from New Guinea to the European islands until the 15th century. Now, interestingly, in 1493, on Christopher Columbus' second journey, he brought sugarcane cuttings to Hispaniola. Now, a lot of people ask me, "Hey, Carolyn, why did he do that? Was it such a big market?" So the answer is yes, it was a big market, but also you have to know Christopher Columbus was actually married to one of the daughters of a sugar baron from Madeira Island, so it made kind of sense. He knew the business, and they basically just wanted to check, does that work in the New World? Because sugar needs warm climates. So it was not so easy to build or to produce in Spain or Portugal. They really had to go Madeira Islands and then down to the Sugar Islands, over the Canary Islands to Sao Tome on the African coast. Now, when Columbus introduced sugarcane cultivation to Hispaniola, that was actually the starting point that we know that the raw material and the base for rum making was brought to the Americas. Now, a very tiny side note. In 1494, so 1 year later, it actually started in 1493, the Portuguese and the Spanish were not really happy with each other, and to prevent a war, Pope Alexander VI actually created the so-called Treaty of Tordesillas. And when this was signed, the world was cut into halves, and everything on one side was actually assigned to the Spanish of the New World, and everything on the other side of this line was given to the Portuguese. Now, the Portuguese were in the lucky or unlucky position, however you want to see that they just, and no one knew the New World really, it wasn't yet mapped completely, that they got the tip of Brazil, the reason why today people speak Portuguese in Brazil. And this tip of Brazil was called Pernambuco. First it was a captaincy, then there were two, and then they actually established very early on sugar production. So the Spanish and the Portuguese held for a long time the monopoly on sugar production and knew how to do that. And the really fascinating thing here is that they immediately had the idea to grow sugarcane in Pernambuco because of the climate, because of the given things. They started off with indigenous workers. They very fast saw they needed more slave workers, so they brought over enslaved African laborers. And by the mid-16th century, so Pernambuco was founded in 1535, it actually became very fast a center of sugar production. And a lot of people may think, well, whoa, hold on. The Spanish, actually, on the other side, they had Hispaniola and much more property in the Caribbean islands. Why didn't they emerge as the sugar productions? Now, my personal opinion here is that goes back to the Treaty of Tordesillas. That moment that the Portuguese actually were condensed on a smaller piece of property, they very much focused on the possibilities and what they could do on this property. So it was a very focused sugar production endeavor, whereas the Spanish got a little sidetracked. I just say as a word, the Spanish silver fleet, and they found gold and lots of other things. Not saying that they did not invest heavily in sugar productions, but it's just that Pernambuco really stuck out as one of the major centers of this time. Now, in this time, molasses was just a byproduct. It was sugar that was the focus. So all Europeans craved sugar. We wanted to have sugar. And so this was the big commodity. We even nicknamed it the white gold. And very important just to take home is that molasses was at this point just a structural surplus. It was not the primary commodity that it is today. Now, about 100 years later, and it is always the same. If someone is really successful, there is someone who's envying it or has other plans. Now, in 1630, the Dutch had the idea, well, let's just go to war and conquest Pernambuco. So they actually went to, with the Dutch West India Company to Pernambuco, seized it. And in that time, something very fascinating happened. Because we have the first time the chance to break open the monopoly of the Spanish and Portuguese sugar production. Now, the style of the Dutch West India Company was very much focused on trade. And this trade is shown. So the Dutch occupancy was from 1630 to 1654, showed that they brought over merchants, technicians, they trained people, and they prioritized credits, shipping, commerce, and with opening up all of this sugar expertise and equipment to others, we actually have documents of people from England coming to see Pernambuco. And so this whole conquest changed a complete, intact sugar production system. And we have the first time a very strong transfer of technology knowledge in sugar making across the colonial systems. And on the left-hand side, you see an old map just to show you how many ships the author just painted down here. So that is just showing you a little bit how busy and how big Pernambuco in the 17th century had grown, which is really must have been a very fascinating thing to see. Now, you might remember from the beginning that I said Barbados claimed himself as the birthplace of rum. And let's just take a look at Barbados. So Barbados, kind of a little bit earlier in parallel, in 1625 was actually becoming English. The first settlers arrived in 1627. And they started off with several crops and also sugarcane. But the real commercial scaling of sugarcane on Barbados began a little bit later in 1640 when James Drax imported a triple roller mill and a copper cauldron from Dutch Pernambuco. So I haven't found any documents that he personally traveled there. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But he also built the first windmill by Dutch design, which also underlines that Dutch were happy to transfer knowledge and to sell knowledge. And so what this means is that in the year of 1640, the island of Barbados started sugar making on a higher commercial scale because they suddenly had the same equipment that Pernambuco had, or a very similar one, and they also had access to the advanced techniques. Now, when the Dutch lost the colony, the Dutch Brazil, in 1654, something else happened. Because we have an accelerated migration of knowledge. Some people fled, a lot of specialized workers fled, and so skilled workers in the sugar field actually supported the growth and pushed actually the sugar monoculture and the growing of a massive sugar market and sugar production on the islands. So this is a rapid shift in this field, which meant we also had certainly a lot of molasses, the byproduct, the leftover. For everyone who doesn't know, at the time we're now talking about, it's not like today. Molasses was actually 4 times as sweet as it is today. So we're having a much higher sugary molasses. So it was actually usable for a lot of other things, as well as sweetening, for instance, teas or other products, or it was used for baking, etc. Now, the Caribbean sugar factories, again, it was just at the moment a byproduct. It was not the primary product we're talking about. We're now in 1640s to 1650s. Here on the left-hand side, this is actually a blow-up of one of the maps I already showed to you. This is in the Tudor Rijksmuseum. And there you see a clear pathway how to cook sugars and produce sugars. So this knowledge was clearly documented. And of course, it was prioritized for the European market. This was the primary product. This is where the most profits were made with. And without a doubt, as I said, molasses was very sugary. If you have something very sugary and hot climate, we have wild geese, we can say, yay, fermentation almost is set to happen automatically. And we do know that these early sugar factories did have small still houses attached. But these were not independent factories at this time and not in a scale like later productions. We also know from early sources that they were products called kill devil or rambolian. And this was also a way for the planters to monetize a little bit of the reducer waste. Now, let's go a little bit into detail of the island of Barbados and the rum production there. It is very well documented. I can recommend a book of Richard Lingen, who observed early on the plantations. He visited the island between 1647 and 1651, and he published his findings. He also writes about rambolian and how the processes work. And we have, among that, a lot of findings that are very, very fascinating. So I can highly recommend that. Also in 1650 on Barbados, there was a plantation deed of the 3 houses in St. Philip's, which is widely cited as the earliest documented use of the word rum. Now, I really cannot go into the details here because I think it is fascinating as much of a problem with terminology. We also have competing references appearing in Barbados and in New England records with a lot of variations from rum to rummy to rambolian. And I think the only thing that this shows that we have from 1650 to 1658 very similar wordings, that there was a rapid spread of this product and no one knew yet how to write it correctly or how to name it correctly. But to really give an answer here, who has the first wording of rum, I leave that to the historians. That's going to be a tricky one, I believe. Now, what we do know, in 1703, we have the oldest surviving deed of a dedicated commercial rum operation. So 1703, that's an important date. This is today Mount Gay. It's an ongoing production that is very impressive. It's awesome. But it is 1703. Just keep the date in mind. Now, let me go real quick over the early rum productions in the Caribbean between 1650 and 1710. Now, between 1650 and 1660, we have rum as a byproduct production on Barbados. So there's several widespread sugar estates. We know 1660 to 1670, we have something similar in Nevis, another island. Then 1660 to 1680, we find this plantation-based rum is made on Antigua and the Lesser Antilles. In 1681, we have a finding for St. Kitts, the old road. Now, 1703 again, Barbados, Mount Gilboa, Mount Gay rum is still, to my knowledge, the first commercial rum distillery in the Caribbean, according to deeds and distillation equipment that is entirely focused on the production of rum, not on sugar making. And we have a second finding in 1710, also in Barbados. There is a plantation established later that is and also an estate-based distillery, St. Nicholas Abbey. Now, what this says is that the production of early rum in the Caribbean was very much tied to first the sugar production and later to independent distilleries starting in 1703, 1710. Now, big jump. We're jumping from the Caribbean to North America. Let me just check the time. Whoa, I need to hurry up. Hold on. So, what happened parallel so we know 1703, oldest distillery, rum production in the Caribbean. Now, what happened parallel in North America? So, I start with William Toy, 1646. So in Boston, Massachusetts Bay Colony, we actually have a reference that he was allowed to distill strong waters. So there is actually a finding of March 4th in 1645, where he was granted the rights to distill on a smaller scale. Now, it's debatable. Strong waters is another catch-all for a lot of things. It doesn't specify. Was it rum? Wasn't it rum? Was it maybe a grain distillate? We don't know. So, but he's very often quoted, and that's why I put him onto the map as one of the earliest rum distillers. And it might be because we remember we had in 1649 we had already grain-based restrictions. If molasses was available, that was for sure one of the products that would have made sense to distill. But as I said, this is an open point of discussion. I think it needs much more research. Was he really a rum distiller, or were there others? Now, there is another hint, and I really want to put that out, by a lady named Annie Haven Twing. She was an American historian that compiled a lot of documents. And she wrote a book in 1920, The Crooked and Narrow Streets of the Town of Boston, 1630 to 1822. And there she states that by 1641, the distilling of rum was largely carried on and distilleries were scattered over various parts of the town. But the larger number were in the neighborhood of Essex and Chardon Street. Now, it is very likely possible that there were already a lot of rum distilleries at this point. And as I said, I highly, highly encourage, if there are historians out there, please do help us finding more research on these early sources. I have just found indications at this point, and I just included William Toy to be complete. And if someone does a Google search and say, hey, Caroline forgot something here. Now, in 1648, I like to go to Emmanuel Downing. So he lived in Salem, Massachusetts, Bay Colony. For everyone who likes to see where that is. So this is an old map again. We have Long Island down here. Here's Boston Harbor, and here's a little tiny Salem, a little bit tucked up north. Now, Emmanuel Downing is really, really interesting early distillation or early distillery that we know of in New England. So from a letter of his wife, we know that his sons studied sugar and distillation practices on Barbados. So he sent his sons in 1648, 1647, supposedly to Barbados. We also know from a letter in December 17, 1648, where Lucy Downing, his wife, writes to her brother, John Winthrop, the governor, that our stillings are popular and in high demand among English settlers, the only complaint being that it is too dear and not enough of it. So that said, they did distill. That is a clear confirmation in her letter. But the more fascinating quote, also in a December 17 letter from Emmanuel Downing to his brother-in-law, was that his product doth surpass any upon the East Coast. That's a clear indication that there were other rum distillers or molasses distillers. And that is, I think, very, very fascinating. We did not find any others, so I cannot call him the first distiller of rum. But he's for sure one of the early ones that we know of. And so just to point this into the correct timeline, this was 1648. The oldest rum distillery in Barbados was 1703. So we also have another endeavor of distilling in, again, 1648. Thomas Ruck, he's often quoted for 1648, but I like to take this timeline a little bit more correct. So we know he was an early commercial distiller in Boston. We know that in 1648, he was active in the trade with Barbados molasses and imports. We know that in 1653, he was licensed to retail strong waters, at this point, likely rum. And in 1658, he was recorded as a distiller in Suffolk County deeds. Now, this is a very early documentation as well. Did he distill already in 1648? We cannot prove that. We just know it was 1658. Nonetheless, he was engaged in this whole process. So he is among the very early distillers. So what does this mean for molasses? Oh, I have to hurry. So molasses, actually, just a little overview, became from a byproduct, a surplus product, suddenly a commodity. And in the late 1650s, we know Barbados and English sugar colonies actually produced it cheap. And then they started to actually import and export regular molasses as well as strong waters. We know also that in 1660s, Newport developed as one of the key rum ports of North America. And it laid the foundation for the later Rhode Island rum dominance that comes much later. Now, the interesting thing here is that grain distillation, whoever argues that we started distilling of grain very early, it was limited, must have been limited because of the scarcity in the rules. But molasses was actually very cheap and it was scalable. And that's the interesting thing. We could get as much molasses as they produced in the Caribbean, and they didn't even need it. So it was a trade-driven spirit. It was not an agricultural surplus that we had here in the US. And this marks the transition from opportunistic to supply-driven production. And looking back into the colonies in Barbados and Jamaica, I will cut this a little bit short, but this is highly, highly documented. And if you like a recommendation, McCusker and also Maynard have a lot of very good books on the topic. So between 1650 and 1700, the molasses byproduct exported to England was immense. It grew steadily. And in 1670 to 1680s, it is estimated that there were 156,000 gallons of molasses exported. It was even so much that they started in the 1660s navigation acts, basically rerouted the molasses over England to count it, to tax it, to send it to the back to the colonies in North America. Of course, it doesn't make sense, and of course, anything that's done to hinder business will lead to ways. People are very inventive to ways to find easier ways. So North Americans did not only buy from the British Islands the molasses, they also bought from the Portuguese, not the Portuguese, from the Dutch and the French islands, and so these were also very cheap molasses. Now we're talking about high volumes here, and we also talking about that with the rising molasses volume, New England was able to expand into higher growth rates. So this leads to the pretty well-known triangular trade that probably a lot of you had covered in school. And for everyone who hasn't seen it yet, the triangular trade is basically referring to a triangle over the Atlantic Ocean where goods, aka molasses, was shipped from the Caribbean up to New England, where it was distilled into rum in ports such as Boston and Newport, and then it was exported back to Africa. And in Africa, it actually paid for the slaves, which were sent back to the colonies to produce the sugar cane and the molasses. So this is a very simplified version of the triangular trade. Important for our narrative here and our project is that rum distilling became structurally integrated into the Atlantic trade system, including the slave-based plantation economy. So that means it was a tremendous driver being in this triangular trade, because the more that was exported to the north, the more of rum could be actually used to buy new slaves. So it was like a spiral up in volumes. And in some estimates, by the 1770s, it was said that rum comprised a dominant share of the New England exports by the 1770s. And other exports they had were lumber, fur, iron, gunpowder, tobacco, and dyes. But definitely the rum became a very, very high commodity. Now, what did this mean? So we have a spiral into a rising production. This also meant that the merchants could build more fleets to transport more of their product. This meant that the ports were built, that the capitals were actually built in Boston and Newport. And it was estimated that in the 17th centuries, over 1,000 colonial vessels launched alone to actually support this merchant fleet. And it also was a payment form. So the colonies could pay for certain British luxury goods or European luxury goods that they brought. So as I said, this is very well documented if you take a look at McCusker from 1989. And it was at the time a huge commercial enterprise. And it was fully, as I said, integrated into the slave-based Atlantic economy. And so it was kind of a circling of the same entities and partners that work together. So this is a little excursus that I like to add on. I know I'm a little bit late, but let me get that in. So rum distilling in the Georgia colony. Why do I like to put this at a little excursus in here? Because it shows that moral idea versus economic reality is actually something different. So Georgia was started as a dry colony. And it was actually a very interesting experiment, let's call it this. They wanted to be dry. They believed it was better for the morale and also for the physical situation of the people building up the colony. But it failed. And the key is they actually lifted the ban in 1742, so a few years later, for very practical reasons. And they acknowledged that rum and the rum production was actually a necessity for commerce and welfare. So they needed the rum and the alcohol production for medicinal purposes. This was one. But the much more important, very likely, I think it was more important, was that they needed it to make trade with the West Indies. So rum basically paid and was a payment form. And without that, the trustees and the colonists learned the use of rum was essential to the welfare of the colonies. So they even admit that. And so this demonstrates a little bit that in the early days, rum was an absolute economic driver. And if you didn't have alcohol in the early colonization, either in form of brandies or of rum, it was very hard to sustain and develop the colony successfully. Now, by 1770s, McCasker actually identifies that at the East Coast were more than 140 rum distilleries. And the annual production exceeded 4.8 million gallons. 2.5 million alone from Rhode Island. And as one can probably logically understand, most of these distilleries were very likely in ports where the molasses entered, and they were a cornerstone of colonial commerce. And what's really important about this is not a small production. We're talking about an industrial scale, large production capacity. And that is something very uniquely, and it was actually driven in the North American colonies. So what happened in the following? Well, I don't want to go. I know we have the renewal of 250 years of the Republic. I have to cut a little bit short in this topic, but I know you all are aware about the Molasses Act in 1733, the 6 pence per gallon, and also the Sugar Act, the 3 pence per gallon in 1764, enforced by George III. Now, what happens if someone tries to interrupt a very profitable system? Well, people try to find solutions for it. And the problem was that these taxes directly constrained the supply chain for the rum distilling. And the rum was actually very critical part of the whole trade. So they needed the profits to sustain their lifestyles, to pay for their bills. And the moment actually this was interrupted, of course, they searched for other ways, from smuggling to other ways, to actually get molasses to the colonies. And the rest is history. Now, by looking at the American Revolution, just to include that, it was very likely financing the independence. And there is a quote of John Adams in 1818 that is exactly reflecting on molasses and the role of rum. I know not why we should blush to confess that molasses was an essential ingredient in American independence. So I think that just says people were aware that molasses was actually a key point of rum making, and rum making was the powerhouse of the colonies. Also to include this, some may know, some may not, some of the declaration signers were actually documented as being part of the rum trade or related merchants in the rum trade. So we have actually 5 signers that that we can tie in. And I think this also shows how rum and the rum business was integrated into the political leadership networks. Now, to summarize the historical significance of North American rum, I would say it drove colonial growth while it was entangling in the Atlantic slave economy. We had over 140 distilleries by the Revolution, and that was really just to show the scale of it. So when the independence came of 250 years ago, we already had a very large rum production and distilling culture in North America, and probably one of the largest in the Western world at the time. And so what I think what should be seen is that it was a complex interplay of morality, innovation, how power shifted, and of course, commerce. And just a side mark, the picture on the left-hand side is a historical drawing, but it's not from North America. It's actually from a Caribbean island. So just to be historically correct here. Now, for brandy and rum, I am lobbying that American brandy and rum are early commercial significant spirits in North America. And as we can summarize, brandy, the commercial distillation, we can prove started in 1634. So this is definitely one of the oldest products that were made in North America. And for rum, there is a completely different story, because the North American distillation played a central role in scaling rum into a commercial commodity, because before that it was just a byproduct. It was not really yet the product. And this changed completely with the role of North American distillers. And it also financed American independence. And I think just these historical facts support that there should be a future recognition and protection of American brandy and rum. Now, again, to summarize, early distillation was very likely fruit-based on a smaller scale. Industrial scale came with rum, because we were not depending on agricultural surpluses anymore. We suddenly could scale. The whiskey dominance was actually a later development. And we know, well, that's another time and another webinar. The whiskey rebellion came a little bit later. Now, as a conclusion, American brandy and rum are not secondary categories. They are actually foundational to the origin of American distilling. What we call heritage today is not necessarily what's documented in the records. And if we align our today categories with historical records, American brandy and American rum are not a niche or something young. They are actually an origin and something historically important for us. And to finalize this, I told you in the beginning, this is actually part 1 and part 2. I'm very sorry to cut it up here, but I know you all probably have hot ears already. But I will continue in Miami on the conference with the historical implication and how we can actually put this into modern trade policy, and how do we understand geographic indications today. I will go exploring pathways, how to recognize American rum. I will have very practical and distiller hands-on suggestions. And believe me, I do not want more regulation. I want just acknowledgement, not over-regulating. And what I also will lobby with Eric from the American Distilling Institute, and I think he's the perfect fit for this job, that we are all together building the longest distillery trail in the world, the American Brandy and Rum Trail, basically connecting all rural America together, all brandy and rum distilleries in America. This will give us a chance to not only make the biggest distillery trail. It will also be a job machine. Just take a look what the Kentucky Bourbon Trail did for Kentucky. But I'm really talking about to connecting history, different places, and make this a beautiful new craft distilling trail. So yeah, I'm coming now to an end, and I am open for questions. I hope I have some time left.
Hello, Caroline. Thank you so much for that. You probably could have gone on for another hour.
I know, sorry.
Can you let me present?
Yeah, how do I stop share? Hold on. Um, how do I do that?
That's good. Yeah, so just a reminder, Miami Beach. We will be there. It is thank you to Clarendon Flavors for sponsoring the conference. We will have the Rum Summit Monday, August 17th, and that will be where we have part two of this, where we can talk about that the subject of the rum trail or the brandy trail or whatever, the AMBRu, I guess. Uh, yeah, it was this summer I went on a tour of distilleries from Florida to Houston, and I had that same thought, which is just there's rum distilleries, we visited 20 distilleries in 5 days, and you're in multiple states, so it really doesn't fall under the purview of any singular state. But yeah, there is a lot of rum culture there. One of the questions we did get uh, from David Klein was on brandy. Have you looked at indigenous fruit? I've seen articles on American persimmons. Are there any other local fruits you have seen?
So I have not yet find any evidence that Native Americans distilled, but now it gets interesting. So we know that every indigenous people probably had beers and wines because distillation kind of happens. But there is one hint that there might have been a pre-Columbian still in the Americas, in today Mexico, and I probably mispronounced that, in Huichol. And so they found in a scripture of a missionary a description of a still that resembles very much a Mongolian still. They later searched for these stills but couldn't find them. But why should I missionary lie about a still design? This is very unlikely. So there is a hint that there have been maybe distilling activities pre-Columbus. Let's start there. I cannot answer that. Were any indigenous fruit like persimmons used? I haven't found any precise documents of settlers that use it, but I'm very pretty sure that anything that was edible was used. I'm just putting myself into the situation. We had scarcity. We had not necessarily surplus. We know from the colony of Georgia that they distilled the corn stalks of the young corn about 1.5 meters. It's like hip height. And they pressed them like sugar cane to press the young fresh juices out and distill them. They claimed it was very good, but I doubt that, but that's a different thing. So as I said, I don't have any proof for persimmons, but I would say very likely yes.
And that early still you were talking about, that would have been agave, right?
Very probably agave. I mean, it was in Mexico. And I mean, Mexico itself is very fascinating on early distilling, but we're jumping. It's a rabbit hole of history, Eric. Just to let everyone know, wherever you touch the distilling history, you'll find lots of rabbit holes where you can dive in. And yes, but it just indicates, however, a still pot might have gotten from Mongolian style, either they invented something similar or not, or it was transported there, who knows. So history is mystery.
Mhm. Well, thank you so much, and thank everybody for attending. And yeah,
Thank you very much and hope to see you all. And if you have questions, write to me, let me know. If you have ideas where to add in and clink in or want to work with AMBRu to support our cause, feel welcome to contact me or Eric, who's now building the longest trail in the world.
thank
Thank
you
you.
all. Bye.
Bye.